a desperate pregnant woman stepped off a midnight coach in the New Mexico territory with nothing but fear in her eyes and a fortune-hungry stepbrother on her trail. She had one last hopee, broken-down cowboy with empty pockets and a heart bigger than the desert sky. In 1885, when powerful men could steal children with the stroke of a pen, Charlotte Van Alstyne knew her unborn baby was worth more than gold to the Boston Railroad baron, who called himself family. Her stepbrother Sebastian had the law, the money, and the Pinkerton agents to prove her unfit and unmarried until she found Jesse Colt mending harness leather by lantern light on the loading dock. Jesse was down to his last silver dollar, facing the loss of his family's homestead, when this refined lady whispered the words that would change everything. "Sir, would you pretend to be my husband? They want my child." What started as an act of frontier chivalry became a desperate race against time, Boston money, and territorial law. But when a pretend marriage must become real to save an innocent life, can two strangers forge something stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jesse Colt had been mending that same piece of harness leather for the better part of an hour, not because it needed such careful attention, but because his hands needed something to do while his mind wrestled with problems that seemed to have no solutions. The loading dock of Martinez Station sat quiet under the New Mexico stars, save for the occasional snort from his old sorrel mare, tethered to the wagon bed filled with sun-cured hideshis, last hope for keeping the family homestead from falling into the hands of Eastern bankers. The tarnished silver spurs hanging from his saddle horn caught the lantern light as he worked. They had belonged to his father, Samuel Colt, and his grandfather before that 3 generations of men who had carved a life from this harsh, beautiful land. The spurs were all Jesse had left of the glory days, when the Colt name meant something in these parts, when their brand was respected from the Pecos to the Rio Grande. Now, at 28, Jesse found himself the last of his line, watching everything his family had built crumble like adobe in a flash flood. The drought had been merciless for 3 straight years, turning their once green pastures into cracked earth that couldn't support more than a handful of cattle. The creek that had run clear and cold through the heart of their property since territorial days had dwindled to a muddy trickle, then disappeared altogether by midsummer. He remembered helping his father repair those same irrigation ditches every spring, the older man's weathered hands teaching younger ones the patient work of coaxing life from reluctant soil. Samuel Colt had been a man of few words but deep conviction, the kind who believed that honest work and stubborn persistence could overcome any hardship. "This land will test you, son," he'd said during Jesse's last conversation with him before the fever took hold. "But if you're worthy of it, it'll provide." Jesse wasn't sure he was worthy anymore. The banknote in his vest pocket, creased from countless worried foldings, spelled out the harsh mathematics of failure: $247 owed by month's end, or forfeit the deed to 600 acres of Colt family legacy. The hides in his wagon might fetch half that amount if he was lucky, and the buyer was generous. It wasn't nearly enough. The homestead itself told the story of his struggle in weathered wood and sagging fence lines. The main house, built by his grandfather's hands from local timber and native stone, still stood solid despite its need for fresh paint and new shingles. But the barn roof leaked, the corrals needed mending, and the windmill that had once pumped sweet water from the underground spring now stood silent, its broken blades pointing accusingly at a sky that had forgotten how to rain. His only companion these days was Bessie, a cantankerous Holstein milk cow who seemed to take personal offense at the state of the world in general and Jesse's circumstances in particular. She had been his mother's pride, a wedding gift from his father in the early days when love and hope were as abundant as grass after spring rains. Now Bessie was getting on in years, her milk production down to barely enough for Jesse's coffee and the occasional batch of cheese he traded in town for supplies. The memories lived in every corner of the property, his mother's vegetable garden, now overrun with weeds and wild sunflowers. The rope swing his father had hung from the great cottonwood by the creek, still there but dry as bleached bone. The family cemetery on the small rise behind the house, where 3 generations of Colts rested under simple wooden crosses, their names carved with Jesse's own knife when grief was too fresh for fancy stonework. At night, when the desert wind whistled through the gaps in the barn siding, Jesse could almost hear their voices, his grandfather's booming laugh, his mother's gentle humming as she worked in the kitchen, his father's quiet words of encouragement during the hardest times. They had all believed in the promise of this land, in the notion that a man could make something lasting if he was willing to pay the price in sweat and sacrifice. But belief didn't pay banknotes, and dreams didn't fill empty water barrels. Jesse had tried everything he could think of to save the place. He'd hired himself out as a ranch hand to neighboring spreads, working sunup to sundown for wages that barely covered his own meals. He'd sold off the cattle one by one, until only Bessie remained. He'd even swallowed his pride and approached the banker about an extension, only to be told that Eastern investors were eager to buy up distressed properties for development. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very railroad money now threatening to swallow his land had once brought prosperity to the territory. In the boom years following the completion of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, cattle ranchers and farmers had flourished, shipping their goods to markets they could never have reached with wagon trains alone. But prosperity had brought speculators, and speculators had brought debt, and debt had a way of transferring ownership from those who worked the land to those who merely owned paper. Still, something deep in Jesse's bones refused to surrender. Maybe it was the stubborn pride that seemed to run in Colt blood, or maybe it was the memory of his father's calloused hands teaching him that some fights were worth having, even when victory seemed impossible. Every morning he woke up in the house where he'd been born, looked out at the land that held his family's bones, and decided to hold on for one more day. The leather in his hands was soft now from working, pliable and strong. Like a man's character, he thought, shaped by pressure and time into something useful. His grandfather had taught him that too, not just about leather, but about life itself. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, the old rancher had said, but by what he's willing to fight for when everything else is gone. As Jesse worked by lamplight on the quiet loading dock, surrounded by the familiar scents of leather and horse and desert sage, he had no way of knowing that his willingness to fight for what mattered was about to be tested in ways his grandfather never could have imagined. The tarnished spurs hanging from his saddle would soon remind him that honor wasn't something a man inherited, it was something he earned, one choice at a time, when the stakes were highest and the odds seemed impossible. The night air carried the sound of an approaching coach, its wheels grinding against the hard-packed dirt of the station road. Jesse looked up from his work, expecting to see the usual collection of drummers and drifters who traveled the late routes. Instead, he would soon encounter a desperate woman whose courage would reawaken his own, whose trust would transform his understanding of what it meant to be worthy of the legacy his family had left behind. The midnight coach rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and creaking leather, its lanterns casting dancing shadows across the adobe walls of Martinez Station. Jesse set down his work and watched as the driver climbed down from his perch, stretching muscles stiff from the long haul across the territory. Only one passenger emerged, a woman moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. Even in the uncertain light, Jesse could see she was refined in a way that spoke of eastern cities and drawing rooms. Her traveling dress, though wrinkled and dusty from the journey, had been expensive once. But it was her face that caught his attention, pale with exhaustion, marked by a fear so deep it seemed to have settled into her bones. Charlotte Van Alstyne, though Jesse wouldn't learn her name, for several more minutes clutched a half-torn valise against her swollen belly, as if it contained the last treasures of a lost kingdom. In many ways, it did. The bag held a few changes of clothes, her mother's jewelry, and a telegram that had shattered her world 3 days earlier. The telegram bore the seal of Arkwright Associates, her stepbrother's Boston law firm, and contained language that chilled her blood. Legal proceedings initiated, custody papers filed, return immediately or face consequences. She had fled that very night, using the last of her hidden money to purchase passage on the first westbound train. Then the coach that brought her here to this dusty crossroads in the middle of nowhere. Her baby was due in less than a month, and every mile she'd traveled had been a race against time and the powerful forces arrayed against her. Jesse watched her approach the telegraph office, her movements urgent despite her obvious fatigue. Through the window, he could see the operator hunched over his key, tapping out messages that connected this remote outpost to the wider world. What Jesse couldn't see were the three men who had arrived on the evening train, men with hard faces and harder credentials that identified them as Pinkerton detectives. The lead agent, a granite-faced man named Hutchins, wore his badge like a shield of righteousness. To him, this was a simple matter of serving legal papers and returning a runaway woman to her rightful guardian. He had no interest in the circumstances that had driven her to flee, was paid to follow orders, and ask no questions that might complicate his commission. Hutchins and his men had been methodical in their approach, checking the hotel registers, questioning the station master, and making their presence known to anyone who might harbor a pregnant fugitive. The custody papers they carried bore official seals and legal language that would be intimidating to any frontier judge, backed as they were by the substantial influence of Sebastian Arkwright's Boston connections. Charlotte Lottie, to those who knew her, well stepped into the telegraph office and immediately sensed the change in atmosphere. The operator looked up nervously, his eyes darting toward the three strangers who had been asking questions all evening. She recognized the type immediately. Professional men, hunters, the kind her stepbrother would hire to retrieve valuable property. "I need to send a message to the territorial marshal," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ma'am," the operator said carefully, "these gentlemen here have been waiting to speak with anyone matching your description." Hutchins stepped forward, his hand moving to the inside of his coat where the custody papers rested. "Mrs. Van Alstyne, I presume? Or should I say, Miss Van Alstyne, given your unmarried condition?" The words hit her like a physical blow. Unmarried. That single word was the key to Sebastian's entire scheme. According to the terms of her mother's trust, custody of any children would default to the nearest male relative if the mother was deemed unfit or unwed. Sebastian had spent months building his case, bribing witnesses and manipulating legal proceedings to ensure that her unmarried status would be the weapon that delivered her child and the fortune that matured in the child's name into his control. "I'm afraid you'll need to come with us." Hutchins continued, his tone professionally neutral. "We have legal authority to escort you back to Boston for proper care during your confinement." Lottie's hand instinctively moved to protect her unborn child. She had studied law in the years before her mother's death, had learned enough to understand the terrible elegance of Sebastian's trap. If she returned to Boston unmarried, she would be confined to a private facility until the birth, declared mentally unstable by physicians on Sebastian's payroll and stripped of all parental rights. Her child would become a ward of the estate, with Sebastian as executor and guardian. "I need some air," she said, backing toward the door. "Ma'am, I'm afraid." But Lottie was already moving, her desperation giving her a burst of energy that carried her out into the night air and across the loading dock, where Jesse sat mending his harness. The Pinkerton men followed, their heavy boots echoing against the wooden planks. Jesse looked up as the pregnant woman stumbled toward him, her face a mask of terror in the lantern light. Behind her, the three men moved, with the purposeful stride of those accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and legal authority. "Please," she whispered, grasping his sleeve with trembling fingers. "Sir, would you pretend to be my husband? They want my child." The words hung in the desert air like a prayer offered to an uncertain God. Jesse found himself looking into eyes that held the desperate courage of a cornered animal, a mother's fierce protection, warring with the knowledge that she was outnumbered and outgunned. Hutchins stepped forward, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "This woman is a fugitive from legal proceedings. We have authority to take her into custody." Jesse stood slowly, his full height revealing a man hardened by years of frontier life. He might be broke, but he wasn't beaten, and something in Lottie's plea had awakened the protective instincts his father had taught him were the mark of a true man. "Fugitive from what?" Jesse asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down charging bulls and cornered rattlesnakes. "Custody proceedings. She's unmarried and unfit to care for her child." "Unmarried?" Jesse looked down at Lottie, seeing the desperate hope flickering in her eyes. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. You're my wife." The lie came so naturally it surprised him. But as soon as the words left his mouth, Jesse felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this moment would define not just the next few hours, but the man he would become. Hutchins frowned, consulting his papers. "We have no record of any marriage." "Territorial wedding," Jesse said smoothly, helping Lottie to her feet with gentle hands. "Not all of us have time for Eastern formalities out here." Lottie stared at him with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. This stranger, this cowboy with kind eyes and work-hardened hands was willingly stepping into the path of forces that could destroy him. She squeezed his arm, playing her part in the desperate charade. "Darling," she said, her voice stronger now, "I was just telling these gentlemen about our ceremony last month." Hutchins wasn't convinced, but territorial marriage laws were notoriously complex, and he had no immediate way to disprove their claim. "We'll need to verify this with the proper authorities." "You do that?" Jesse said, already moving toward his wagon. "But right now, I'm taking my wife home. She's had a long journey, and travel in her condition isn't something to take lightly." Before the Pinkertons could object, Jesse had helped Lottie into the wagon seat and was gathering the reins. His old sorrel mare, sensing the urgency in her master's movements, stepped forward eagerly. "This isn't over," Hutchins called after them. "No," Jesse agreed, clicking to his horse. "I don't expect it is." As the wagon rolled away from Martinez Station, Lottie felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. She had thrown herself on the mercy of a complete stranger, and somehow, miraculously, he had caught her. "Why?" she asked, as they headed into the darkness toward the Mesa country. "Why would you help me?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of wheels on hard earth and harness leather, creaking with the wagon's movement. "My father always said a man's character is measured by what he does when nobody's watching and nothing's in it for him. But there could be consequences. These men have money, influence." "Ma'am," Jesse interrupted gently, "some things are more important than consequences." As they rode through the night toward the Colt homestead, neither of them could have imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be. The simple act of kindness that had begun this strange partnership would soon be tested by forces more powerful than either had dreamed possible. Behind them, in the telegraph office, Hutchins was already composing a message to Sebastian in Boston. "Target located. Claims married status. Investigating validity. Advise." The hunt was just beginning. Dawn found them at the edge of Jesse's property, where the desert scrubland gave way to what had once been fertile grazing land. The first light revealed the full extent of the Colt homestead's decline-weathered fence posts, tilting at defeated angles, irrigation ditches choked with tumbleweeds, and a windmill standing motionless against the morning sky, like a monument to better times. But Lottie saw something else in the golden light, stretching across the valley. She saw possibility in the solid bones of the main house, potential in the broad acres that waited for rain, and hope in the quiet dignity of a man who had risked everything for a stranger's desperate plea. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Jesse glanced at her skeptically. "It's failing." "Things that are failing can be saved," she replied, her hand moving protectively over her swollen belly. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them again." They had talked through the night as the wagon carried them across the Mesa country, sharing pieces of their stories like travelers warming themselves around the same fire. Jesse had learned about her mother's death 2 years earlier, the trust fund that would mature when her child came of age, and Sebastian's cold calculation in pursuing custody. Lottie had heard about the drought, the failing ranch, and Jesse's desperate hope that the wagon full of hides might save his family's legacy. "We need to make this look convincing," Lottie said as they approached the main house. "If those men come looking, and they will, everything must appear legitimate." Jesse nodded, though the practical implications of harboring a pregnant woman were beginning to settle on his shoulders like a heavy pack. His house had been a bachelor's domain for so long that he'd forgotten how to consider another person's comfort. The spare bedroom where his parents had slept still held their furniture, covered in dust and memories. "There's a room that was my mother's," he said awkwardly. "It's not much, but it's private." Lottie smiled at his obvious discomfort. "Mr. Colt, I'm grateful for anything you can spare. But if we're to convince anyone of our marriage, perhaps we should start by using first names." "Jesse," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "And you're?" "Charlotte, but everyone calls me Lottie." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Jesse's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle tucked under the wagon seat, then relaxed as he recognized the approaching rider. Father Matteo Sandoval rode a patient bay gelding with the easy grace of a man who had spent equal time in the saddle and the pulpit, ministering to scattered congregations across the territory. Matteo had been Jesse's friend since childhood, when both boys had attended the mission school before their paths diverged, one toward the priesthood, the other toward the demanding life of a rancher. The priest's weathered brown hands told the story of a man who practiced what he preached about serving others, whether that meant delivering babies in remote homesteads or helping with harvest when a family faced hardship. "Jesse," Matteo called out, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the practiced observation of someone accustomed to reading human nature. "I heard there was some excitement at Martinez Station last night." "Word travels fast," Jesse replied, moving to stand beside Lottie in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Matteo's gaze settled on Lottie with gentle curiosity. "And you must be the lady in question." "I'm Father Matteo Sandoval." "Charlotte van Alstyne," she said, then caught herself. "Charlotte Colt." The priest's eyebrows rose slightly at the correction, but his smile remained warm. "Congratulations are in order, then. Though I must admit, I'm surprised Jesse didn't mention any wedding plans when I saw him last month." Jesse and Lottie exchanged a quick glance. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected, and their hastily constructed fiction was about to face its first real test. "It was sudden," Lottie said carefully. "We've known each other through correspondence, and when circumstances required, well, love doesn't always wait for convenient timing." Matteo studied them both with the shrewd eyes of a man who had heard every possible variation of human folly and redemption. Something in their manner suggested a story more complex than a simple frontier romance. But he had learned long ago that sometimes the truth served God's purposes better than the facts. "Of course," he said diplomatically, "though I hope you won't mind if I mention that territorial law requires proper documentation for marriages to be legally recognized. Not everyone is as understanding as old friends." Jesse felt his heart sink. If their marriage wasn't legally valid, then Lottie's protection was an illusion that would crumble the moment Sebastian's lawyers arrived with their custody papers. But Lottie stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying legal documents. "Father, would you be willing to perform a blessing ceremony, something that would formalize our union in the eyes of the community?" Matteo looked between them, reading the desperate hope in Lottie's eyes and the determined protection in Jesse's stance. Whatever story had brought them together, it was clear that powerful forces were arrayed against them. As a priest, his duty was to serve God's will, and he had always believed that will included protecting the innocent from those who would abuse their power. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a small hand-carved wooden crucifix, worn smooth by countless benedictions. His grandfather had carved it in the old days when Spanish missions dotted the territory, and it had blessed marriages, baptisms, and final rites for 3 generations of frontier families. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that would be entirely appropriate. After all, God recognizes the bonds of the heart long before lawyers recognize the bonds of paper." Within the hour, they had assembled on the front porch of the Colt homestead for what had to be the most unconventional wedding ceremony in territorial history. Jesse had cleaned up as best he could, changing into his one good shirt and the black trousers he wore to church on the rare occasions when circumstances allowed. Lottie had brushed the travel dust from her dress and arranged her dark hair in a simple style that emphasized the delicate beauty her exhaustion couldn't quite hide. Matteo held his grandfather's crucifix as he spoke words that had united countless couples across the generations, adapting the traditional vows to circumstances that were anything but traditional. When he asked if they would honor and cherish each other for as long as God granted them life, both Jesse and Lottie answered with a conviction that surprised them both. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of New Mexico," Matteo said solemnly, "I pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that sealed their union was brief and gentle, a promise between strangers who were learning to trust each other with their lives. But in that moment, with the morning sun warming the old adobe walls and Father Matteo's blessing echoing across the valley, something real passed between them, a recognition that their pretend marriage might become the foundation for something genuine and lasting. "Now," Matteo said, producing a feed invoice from his pocket and a stub of pencil, "let's make sure this is properly documented." He wrote out the marriage certificate in his careful script, noting the date, location, and parties involved. It wasn't the elaborate document a Boston society wedding might have produced, but it was official enough to satisfy territorial requirements. "Keep this safe," he advised, handing the paper to Jesse. "You may need it sooner than you think." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Jesse squinted against the morning sun and counted 3 riders moving toward the homestead at a purposeful pace. "The Pinkerton men," Lottie whispered, her face going pale. "Let me handle this," Jesse said, moving to stand between her and the approaching threat. But Lottie straightened her shoulders and took her place beside him, her hand finding his with surprising strength. "We handle this together," she said firmly. "We're married now, remember?" Matteo tucked his crucifix back into his robes and settled into the old rocking chair on the porch, making it clear he had no intention of leaving. "I think I'll stay for a while," he said mildly. "It's not often I get to visit with newlyweds." As the Pinkerton agents approached, Jesse felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a yoke he had chosen to bear. He was no longer just protecting a desperate stranger. He was defending his wife, their unborn child, and the home that had sheltered 3 generations of Colt family dreams. 2 days after the Pinkerton agents had ridden away with grudging acceptance of the marriage certificate, a different kind of threat arrived in Martinez Station. Sebastian stepped off the eastbound train with the bearing of a man accustomed to having the world arrange itself according to his wishes. His expensive traveling suit remained immaculate despite the long journey, and his leather attaché case contained documents that could reshape the legal landscape of the entire territory. At 35, Sebastian had inherited more than just his stepfather's railroad fortune. He had inherited the ruthless intelligence that had built that fortune from nothing. His mother's marriage to Charlotte's father had been strategic, designed to merge 2 substantial estates, and Sebastian had learned early that sentiment was a luxury only the poor could afford. The territorial courthouse in Martinez Station was a modest adobe building that had seen better days, but it served Sebastian's purposes perfectly. Small-town judges, he had learned, were often more practical than their big city counterparts when it came to understanding the beneficial relationship between justice and financial consideration. Judge Harrison Clemmer was a thin, nervous man who had held his position for 12 years through careful attention to the political winds that blew across the territory. When Sebastian presented himself with a letter of introduction from the governor's office and a donation to the court building fund, Clemmer was prepared to be very accommodating indeed. The situation is quite simple, Your Honor, Sebastian explained, spreading documents across the judge's desk with the precision of a general deploying troops. My stepsister has suffered a nervous breakdown following the death of our mother. She fled Boston against medical advice and appears to have contracted some sort of hasty marriage to avoid the custody provisions of her inheritance. Clemmer studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who understood that his continued prosperity depended on making the right friends. The Boston legal documents were impressive in their complexity, filled with references to interstate commerce, territorial jurisdiction, and the protection of trust fund assets. The marriage certificate appears to be in order, Clemmer said cautiously. Ah, but that's where territorial law becomes quite interesting, Sebastian replied, withdrawing a leather-bound ledger from his case. The book contained his careful research into the legal loopholes that governed frontier marriages, compiled during weeks of preparation for this moment. According to Statute 47 of the Territorial Marriage Code, he continued, opening to a marked page, any marriage contracted without proper license and witnessed registration can be nullified by judicial review if substantial evidence exists of fraud or coercion. Sebastian set a stack of crisp bills on the desk beside the ledger. I'm prepared to donate substantially to the court's discretionary fund to ensure this matter receives the thorough legal attention it deserves. Judge Clemmer looked at the money, then at the documents, then at Sebastian's confident smile. The mathematics of the situation were painfully clear. A struggling territorial court could accomplish a great deal with such a generous donation, while refusing it might result in uncomfortable questions from territorial authorities about judicial efficiency. I'll need to review the marriage certificate in question, Clemmer said, his tone suggesting the review's outcome was already determined. Meanwhile, at the Colt homestead, Jesse was discovering that married life, even pretend married life, required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. Lottie had proven to be surprisingly practical, despite her refined background, helping with daily chores and demonstrating a knowledge of cooking that surpassed his own limited bachelor skills. Your mother's garden could be restored, she said, surveying the weed-choked plot behind the house. The soil is still good underneath, and some of these plants are just dormant, not dead. Jesse watched her move carefully through the overgrown rows, her pregnancy making every step deliberate, but not stopping her from envisioning possibilities he had given up seeing. She had a way of looking at broken things and seeing their potential rather than their failure. That would take water, he said. Water we don't have. Water can be found, she replied, kneeling to examine a struggling tomato plant that had somehow survived the drought. Your grandfather's stories about the Apache Spring, you don't think they were just tales, do you? The question caught Jesse off guard. He had grown up hearing those stories, legends really, about a hidden spring in the back pasture that had sustained Apache camps in the old days, before the land became part of the Colt ranch. His grandfather had claimed to have seen it once, but after years of drought and desperate searching, Jesse had dismissed the stories as wishful thinking. Even if the spring exists, he said, it wouldn't matter. Sebastian's lawyers probably own the water rights by now. Eastern money has a way of buying up everything that isn't nailed down. Lottie stood carefully, brushing dirt from her hands. Not everything can be bought, Jesse. Some things have to be earned. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Lottie broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. We need to talk about what happens when the baby comes, she said quietly. Jesse looked up from his plate, struck by the reality of the situation. In less than a month, their makeshift household would include a newborn child, and his experience with babies extended no further than helping birth calves and foals. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. Mrs. Delgado in town has experience with birthing. I could arrange for her to come when the time gets close. That's practical, Lottie agreed, but I meant something more than just the logistics. Jesse, when this baby is born, Sebastian will have legal grounds to challenge our marriage if he can prove it was contracted solely to circumvent the trust provisions. She leaned forward, her dark eyes serious in the lamplight. "I need you to understand what you've gotten yourself into. This isn't just about helping a stranger anymore. This is about standing against people who have the power to destroy you, financially, legally, even physically if they choose." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert night through the open window. Somewhere out there, powerful forces were mobilizing against them, but sitting across the table from this brave, intelligent woman, he found he cared less about the odds than about proving himself worthy of her trust. "Lottie," he said finally, "I'm not much for fancy words or legal maneuvering, but I gave you my word, and a man's word is about all he really owns in this world." She reached across the table to touch his hand, her fingers warm against his work-roughened skin. "I know that, but I also know you're risking everything you have left for someone you barely know." "Maybe," Jesse said, turning his hand to clasp hers gently. "Or maybe I'm finally fighting for something worth having." The next morning brought Father Mateo with news that chilled them both. He had been in town when Sebastian arrived, had witnessed the meeting at the courthouse, and understood enough about territorial politics to recognize the threat they faced. "Judge Clemmer has agreed to review your marriage certificate," Mateo reported, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. "Sebastian Arkwright has essentially bought himself a legal nullification." "How long do we have?" Lottie asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Clemmer will want to make it look legitimate, so he'll go through the motions of a hearing." Jesse felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same helpless anger he had experienced watching drought kill his cattle and debt consume his land. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't facing the challenge alone. "There has to be something we can do," he said. Lottie was already thinking, her legal training engaging with the problem like a key finding its lock. "Actually, there might be. Jesse, do you still have the deed to this property?" "Of course. It's in my father's strongbox." "What about water rights? Are they included in the deed or filed separately?" Jesse frowned, trying to remember the details of documents he had inherited rather than studied. "I think they're separate. My grandfather filed the original water claim back in territorial days, but I haven't looked at those papers in years." "We need to look at them now," Lottie said urgently. "If your family has legitimate water rights to that Apache spring, and if we can prove its location and stake a legal claim, there might be a way to make our marriage unbreakable under territorial law." "How?" "Land in kind dowry," she said, her eyes bright with possibility. "If I can deed half the water rights to myself as a marriage settlement, the union becomes legally binding regardless of licensing technicalities. It's an old territorial provision designed to protect frontier marriages, but it's still valid law." Jesse stared at her, amazed by the quick intelligence that could find hope in what seemed like an impossible situation. "You really think it would work?" "I think it's our only chance," she replied. "But first, we have to find that spring." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the valley. But this time, it wasn't Pinkerton agents or territorial officials. It was one of Sebastian's hired men, a lean gunslinger named Garrett, who wore his weapons with the casual familiarity of long practice. "Message from Mr. Arkwright," Garrett called out, reining in his horse just beyond the front porch. "He's prepared to make you a generous offer for the lady's return to Boston. $5,000, cash money." Jesse stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting casually on the rifle he had taken to keeping close. "Tell Mr. Arkwright that Mrs. Colt isn't for sale." Garrett's smile was cold and professional. "Everything's for sale, Cowboy. It's just a matter of finding the right price." "You found my price," Jesse replied evenly. "It's more than Sebastian Arkwright has." After Garrett rode away, Lottie emerged from the house where she had been listening to every word. $5,000, she said quietly. "That's more than enough to save your ranch." Jesse turned to look at her, seeing the fear and vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide behind her brave facade. "Lottie, do you honestly think I'd sell my wife for money?" "I'm not really your wife," she whispered. "Maybe not," Jesse said. his voice gentle but firm. "But you're carrying my name now, and that means something. It means you're under my protection, and anyone who wants to hurt you has to go through me first." Standing there on the porch of his failing ranch, facing forces more powerful than anything his family had ever confronted, Jesse Colt made a choice that would define not just the next few days, but the man he would become. The tarnished spurs hanging in his father's closet would have to wait was earning his own legacy now, one decision at a time. The brass seal of the Territorial Land Office gleamed in the morning sun as Judge Clemmer examined it carefully. Understanding that this simple tool represented the power to legitimize or destroy the desperate gamble unfolding across his jurisdiction. Word had reached the Colt homestead through Father Mateo's network of concerned parishioners. Sebastian had successfully convinced the judge to schedule a hearing that would nullify any marriage lacking proper territorial licensing. 3 days, Jesse said grimly, spreading his grandfather's old survey maps across the kitchen table. "That's all we have to find the spring, stake it properly, and file the water rights before Clemmer declares our marriage invalid." Lottie studied the hand-drawn maps with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on reading them correctly. The papers were yellow with age, marked in her grandfather-in-law's careful script with notations about seasonal water flow, Apache camping sites, and geological features that might indicate underground springs. "Look here," she said, pointing to a section of the back pasture marked with symbols she didn't recognize. "Your grandfather noted seasonal seepage and Apache markers. What do you think he meant by markers?" Jesse leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers as they bent over the maps together. Despite everything else they faced, he found himself increasingly aware of her presence, the way she unconsciously touched her belly when deep in thought, the determined set of her jaw when she refused to give up hope, the quiet strength that had carried her across a continent to protect her unborn child. "Could be anything," he said, forcing himself to concentrate on the map. The Apache used stone cairns, bent trees, sometimes just scratches on rocks to mark important places. Most folks wouldn't recognize them even if they saw them. But you might? Maybe. My grandfather spent time with the Apache in the early days, before the territory got so settled. He learned some of their ways. What Jesse didn't say was that he had spent countless hours as a boy listening to those stories, imagining himself as brave as the warriors and scouts his grandfather had known. Now, faced with a real test of courage, he wondered if those childhood dreams had prepared him for anything more than storytelling. Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, but this one brought news that struck them like a physical blow. Tom Martinez, the station master, rode up in obvious agitation, his horse lathered from hard travel. "Jesse," he called out before he'd even dismounted, "you need to know what that Boston fellow has been up to in town." "Sebastian?" Lottie asked, appearing in the doorway. "That's the one. Ma'am, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but he's been buying up paper on every ranch in the valley. Water rights, grazing rights, mineral claims, anything that wasn't nailed down tight." Jesse felt the familiar cold weight of inevitability settling in his stomach. "How much paper?" "Near everything between here and the river. Paid premium prices too, which has folks wondering why Eastern money would want worthless drought land." But Lottie understood immediately. "He's not buying the land," she said slowly. "He's buying the legal foundation under our feet. If he controls all the water rights in the area, any claim we make will be worthless." Tom nodded grimly. "There's more. He's hired on some hard cases from down El Paso way, men who know their business, if you take my meaning." Jesse did take his meaning. Sebastian wasn't just fighting them in court, was preparing for the possibility that legal maneuvering might not be enough. Men who knew their business, in places like El Paso, were usually skilled at making problems disappear permanently. After Tom left with promises to keep his ears open for useful information, Jesse and Lottie sat in their kitchen and faced the full magnitude of what they were up against. It wasn't just Sebastian's money or legal connections, it was a systematic campaign to eliminate every possible escape route. "Maybe," Jesse said quietly, You should consider his offer. $5,000 would get you far from here, somewhere he couldn't follow. Lottie looked at him with an expression that was part exasperation, part fondness. Jesse Colt, for a man who's never backed down from a fight in his life, you certainly spend a lot of time trying to convince me to run away. That's different. This is about protecting you and the baby. And what about protecting you? She asked. Do you think Sebastian will just let you walk away after this is over? You've seen his plans, heard his threats. You're as much a target now as I am. The truth of her words settled between them like a challenge neither could ignore. They were bound together now, not just by their desperate alliance, but by the simple fact that Sebastian would never forgive either of them for standing in his way. Then we'd better find that spring, Jesse said. They spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be their final gamble. Jesse gathered surveying equipment from the barn chains and stakes his grandfather had used to mark property boundaries in the territorial days. Lottie packed provisions and studied the maps until she could trace every line and notation from memory. There's something else we need to consider, she said as evening approached. Even if we find the spring and file the claim, Sebastian will challenge it in court. We need witnesses, documentation, proof that the water source has been part of your family's holdings from the beginning. Jesse nodded, understanding her legal mind was already thinking several moves ahead. Father Mateo knew my grandfather. He might remember stories about the spring. That's good, but we need more. Physical evidence, historical documentation, something that establishes your family's prior claim. As if responding to her words, Jesse remembered something that made him pause. Wait here, he said, disappearing into his parents' old bedroom. He returned, carrying a wooden box that had belonged to his grandfather, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents and artifacts from the early days of the ranch. The original territorial deed, correspondence with Apache leaders, and photographs of the homestead in its prime. But it was a small leather journal that caught Lottie's attention. The pages were filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting, documenting daily life on the frontier, with the precision of a man who understood that history was made of such small details. Look at this, she said, pointing to an entry dated 20 years earlier. Spoke with Spotted Horse about water sources. He confirmed spring location matches, tribal memory. Marked boundaries with stone cairns as agreed. Jesse leaned over her shoulder to read the faded ink. Spotted Horse was an Apache chief. He and my grandfather made some kind of peace agreement about water sharing. This is exactly what we need, Lottie said excitedly. Documentation of prior use, indigenous confirmation, established boundaries. If we can find those stone cairns, we have proof that your family has legitimate historical claim to the water rights. But even as hope flickered between them, the sound of approaching horses reminded them that time was running out. This time it was Father Mateo, riding hard with news that drained the color from both their faces. Sebastian has convinced Judge Clemmer to move up the hearing, the priest announced without preamble. Tomorrow morning, he claims new evidence has come to light about the fraudulent nature of your marriage. What kind of evidence? Jesse asked. Witnesses willing to testify that they saw Lottie arrive alone on the midnight coach, that you two had never met before that night. Lottie sank into a chair, the weight of her pregnancy and their mounting troubles suddenly overwhelming. Then it's over. We'll never find the spring and file the claim in time. Not necessarily, Mateo said, his eyes bright with an idea that was either inspired or completely mad. What if we don't wait for morning? Jesse stared at his old friend. What do you mean? The land office stays open until sunset for emergency filings. If you can find that spring and stake it before dark tomorrow, you can file the claim before the hearing even begins. That's cutting it awfully close, Jesse said. Close is all we have left, Lottie replied, her hand moving to the small of her back where the baby's weight was beginning to cause constant discomfort. How long would it take to search the back pasture? Jesse calculated distances and terrain in his head. If we start at first light and know where to look, maybe. But Lottie, that's rough country, and you're... I'm pregnant, not helpless, she interrupted firmly, and this is my fight as much as yours. Mateo watched the exchange with the knowing eyes of someone who had witnessed many couples discover what they meant to each other under pressure. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was transforming into something deeper, though neither Jesse nor Lottie seemed fully aware of the change yet. "There's something else," the priest said quietly. "I've heard talk in town about Sebastian's hired men. They're planning something for tomorrow, something that doesn't involve waiting for legal proceedings." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sebastian was preparing for the possibility that the law might not deliver the outcome he wanted, and men like Garrett didn't solve problems with writs and court orders. "All the more reason to move fast," Jesse said grimly. "If we can file that claim and make the marriage legally unbreakable, Sebastian loses his legal justification for taking Lottie back to Boston. And if we can't..." Jesse looked at his wife Anne somewhere during the long day of planning and hoping together. He had begun thinking of her that way and saw the same determined courage that had carried her across a continent to protect her child. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said simply, "together." That night, as they made final preparations for their desperate gamble, neither could sleep. Jesse sat on the front porch, cleaning his father's old Winchester and listening to the desert sounds that had been the soundtrack of his entire life. Lottie moved carefully around the kitchen, packing provisions and checking supplies with the methodical attention of someone who understood that overlooking a single detail might mean the difference between success and disaster. "Jesse," she called softly from the doorway. "Right here." "Thank you," she said, settling carefully beside him on the porch step. "Not just for helping me, but for making me feel like I belong somewhere again." Jesse looked at her profile in the starlight, struck by how natural it felt to have her there beside him, how right it seemed, despite the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. "You do belong here," he said, meaning it more than he had expected. "This place has been dying without a family to fill it. Maybe that's what it's been waiting for all along." Above them, the New Mexico stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but somehow reassuring in their permanence. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test either of them had ever faced, but tonight they sat together on the porch of the Colt homestead, no longer quite strangers, not yet quite lovers, but something deeper than either partners in a fight that would define the rest of their lives. Dawn brought the discovery that would change everything. As Jesse saddled their horses in the grey pre-light, Lottie emerged from the house, carrying something that made him stop mid-motion. In her hands was an ancient water gourd, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the uncertain light. "I found it in your grandfather's chest," she said, her voice hushed with wonder, hidden beneath the other papers wrapped in deerskin. Jesse set down the bridle and took the gourd carefully, feeling the weight of history in the carved vessel. The symbols were Apache, he was certain, though their meaning was lost to him. But the craftsmanship spoke of reverence, of something created to honor the sacred relationship between people and the water that sustained all life. "He never mentioned this," Jesse said, turning the gourd in his hands. "Maybe he was saving it for the right time," Lottie suggested. "Or maybe he knew that someday his family would need to prove their connection to this land went deeper than legal documents." As the morning light strengthened, they could see riders on the distant hills, Sebastian's men, positioning themselves to watch every approach to the back pasture. The message was clear. Any attempt to reach the spring would have to run a gauntlet of professional gunmen who had no qualms about stopping them permanently. "They're not trying to hide," Jesse observed, adjusting the rifle scabbard on his saddle. "Sebastian wants us to know they're there." "Intimidation," Lottie agreed. "He's counting on us being too frightened to try." But as Jesse helped her mount the gentle mare he had chosen for her condition, he saw no fear in her eyes, only the same determined courage that had carried her this far. Her pregnancy made every movement deliberate and careful, but it hadn't diminished the steel in her spine. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, following game trails that wound through the scrub and sage toward the rougher country of the back pasture. Jesse carried his grandfather's journal and the Apache water gourd, while Lottie bore the surveying equipment and the legal documents that would legitimize their claim if they could find what they were looking for. The first Apache marker appeared after an hour of careful searching, a pile of stones arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to casual observers, but would guide those who understood the old ways. Jesse felt his grandfather's presence strongly as he recognized the arrangement, remembering stories of how the Apache had shared their knowledge with the few white settlers who approached them with respect rather than conquest. "There," he said, pointing to a second marker on a ridge 50 yards ahead. "They're leading us somewhere." But they weren't the only ones following the ancient trail. The sound of hoofbeats echoed from their back trail, and Jesse counted at least 4 riders, maintaining a steady pace behind them. Sebastian's men were patient professionals who understood that sometimes the best way to stop someone was to let them lead you to exactly where they were going. "They're following us to the spring," Lottie said, her hand moving instinctively to protect her belly as her mare picked her way carefully over the rocky ground. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Jesse replied, his mind working through possibilities. "If they want to know where the spring is, it means Sebastian doesn't know either. He's been buying up water rights blind, hoping to cover all the possibilities." The terrain grew rougher as they climbed toward the high pasture, and Lottie's discomfort became more obvious despite her efforts to hide it. Jesse called frequent rest stops, using the excuse of checking the trail markers while actually giving her time to recover from the constant motion. During one such stop, she surprised him by speaking about something that had been weighing on her mind since their wedding ceremony. "Jesse, when this is over, if we win, what happens to us?" He looked up from the Apache symbols he had been studying, struck by the complexity of a question he had been avoiding. Their marriage had been conceived as a temporary expedient, a legal fiction to protect her from Sebastian's schemes. But somewhere along the trail of shared dangers and growing respect, the pretense had begun to feel like something more substantial. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I suppose that depends on what you want to happen." "I've been thinking about that," she said, accepting his help to remount, despite the obvious strain it caused. "I've spent my whole life in Boston drawing rooms, learning to be ornamental rather than useful. But here, working beside you, I feel like I'm finally becoming someone real." Jesse felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this brave, intelligent woman had become essential to his vision of the future in ways that had nothing to do with legal convenience. "You've always been real, Lottie. You just needed to find the right place to show it." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from behind them. One of Sebastian's riders had closed the distance and was calling out with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Van Alstyne, you need to stop this foolishness and come with us now." Jesse reined his horse around to face the threat, his hand moving to the rifle he had hoped not to need. But Lottie surprised him by spurring her mare forward, placing herself between Jesse and the approaching gunman. "My name is Mrs. Colt," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air, "and I'm exactly where I belong." The rider Garrett, Jesse recognized, seemed genuinely surprised by her defiance. He had obviously expected to intimidate a pampered Eastern lady into submission, not face a woman who had found her backbone on the frontier. "Ma'am, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. Mr. Arkwright has the territorial governor's ear, federal connections, enough money to buy this entire territory if he chooses. You can't win this fight." "Maybe not," Lottie replied, her hand finding Jesse's as their horses stood side by side. "But I can choose how I lose it." As if summoned by her words, the sound they had been hoping for reached their ears, the musical trickle of running water echoing off canyon walls ahead. Jesse felt his heart leap as he recognized the location from his grandfather's stories, a hidden box canyon where Apache families had camped during the dry seasons, sustained by a spring that had never failed, even in the worst drought years. "The spring," he breathed. But Garrett had heard it too, and his hand moved to his gun with the smooth motion of long practice. "I'm afraid I can't let you go any farther." "You're on Colt family land," Jesse said evenly, his own weapon still holstered but ready. "That makes you a trespasser." "Not for long," Garrett replied. "After today, this will all belong to Mr. Arkwright." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, 3 people on horseback in the middle of nowhere, each representing forces larger than themselves. Behind Garrett, more riders were approaching. Behind Jesse and Lottie, the sound of water promised salvation if they could reach it. "Lottie," Jesse said quietly, never taking his eyes off Garrett. "When I give the word, you ride for that canyon as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just get to the spring." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You're not leaving me. You're saving our child." The words hung in the desert air with the weight of absolute truth. In that moment, both Jesse and Lottie understood that their pretend marriage had become something deeper than either had expected. Partnership founded on mutual respect, shared courage, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for each other. Garrett's patience was running out, and his hand tightened on his gun. "Last chance, folks. Come with me peaceful, or—" He never finished the sentence. Jesse's rifle was in his hands and speaking with deadly authority before Garrett could clear leather, the shot echoing off canyon walls like thunder from an angry god. The hired gun tumbled from his saddle, more surprised than hurt by the bullet that had creased his shoulder. "Go!" Jesse shouted, and Lottie spurred her mare toward the canyon mouth with desperate urgency. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses grew louder as Sebastian's remaining men realized that their quarry was no longer running blind, but racing toward a specific destination. The chase was on, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of 3 lives and the land that had shaped them all. As they plunged into the narrow canyon where Apache water had sustained life for countless generations, Jesse felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. The carved gourd bounced against his saddle horn with each stride, and somewhere ahead, the sound of running water promised either salvation or the place where they would make their final stand. The Apache spring emerged from the canyon wall like a gift from the earth itself, clear water flowing from ancient stone into a natural basin that had been carved by centuries of patient erosion. But it was what Jesse found beside the spring that stopped him cold, his grandfather's journal falling from nerveless fingers as he stared at the impossible truth. There, protected by a careful arrangement of stones and marked with the faded remnants of territorial survey stakes, was evidence that changed everything. A hand-drawn map, sealed in oiled leather and wrapped in Apache deerskin, showed not just the spring but an entire watershed that extended far beyond what Jesse had ever imagined his family owned. "My God," Lottie whispered, dismounting carefully to examine the find. "Jesse, this isn't just a water source. It's a complete survey of underground water rights covering half the territory." The map was in Jesse's grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, but it bore an official territorial seal and the signature of a territorial surveyor named Edmund Colt, Jesse's great-grandfather, a man he had never known existed. "I don't understand," Jesse said, kneeling beside the ancient documents. "My grandfather never mentioned having a father who was a territorial surveyor." But Lottie's legal training allowed her to read between the lines of the bureaucratic language, and what she found made her heart race with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. "Jesse, look at these boundaries. According to this survey, your family doesn't just own the water rights to this spring, you own the underground water rights to most of the valley, including every piece of property Sebastian has been buying up." The sound of approaching horses reminded them that Sebastian's men were closing in, but the discovery had transformed their desperate situation into something entirely different. If the survey was legitimate and the territorial seals and signatures suggested it was, then Sebastian had been wasting his money buying worthless surface rights while the real value lay in the water flowing beneath the ground. "He doesn't know," Jesse said, understanding flooding through him like the clear water that bubbled up from the earth. "Sebastian's been operating blind, assuming he could buy control of the water by purchasing surface property. But if these documents are real, then you own the water under every ranch he's purchased," Lottie finished. His entire scheme collapses. But even as hope flickered between them, a new sound reached their ears, Lottie's sharp intake of breath as her hand flew to her belly. The combination of hard riding, stress, and the baby's position had triggered what every pregnant woman feared most: the onset of premature labor. "Jesse," she gasped, "something's wrong." He was beside her instantly, his strong hands supporting her as another contraction gripped her body. The timing couldn't have been worse. Sebastian's men were minutes away. They had to stake their claim and reach the land office before sunset, and now the woman who had become the center of his world was facing the ordeal of childbirth in the middle of nowhere. "How far apart?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear that was racing through his veins. "I don't know, maybe 10 minutes? Jesse, this is too early. The baby isn't supposed to come for another month." But Mother Nature had her own schedule, and stress had a way of accelerating natural processes. As another contraction seized her, stronger than the first, they both understood that their desperate gamble had just become infinitely more complicated. "We have to get you back to town," Jesse said, already planning how to carry her if necessary. "No," Lottie said firmly, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "We stake this claim first. If we don't file before the hearing, everything we've done is meaningless." "Lottie, you're in labor." "I'm in labor, not dead," she interrupted, though her pale face revealed the cost of her brave words. "How long does it take to survey a water source?" Jesse looked around the spring area, estimating the work required. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if I'm careful about the measurements." "Then do it," she said, settling herself carefully against a smooth boulder. "I'll time the contractions and let you know when we need to leave." It was madness, but it was also the only chance they had. Jesse pulled out his grandfather's surveying equipment and began the careful work of measuring and marking the spring's boundaries, while Lottie watched the canyon mouth for signs of Sebastian's men and fought to control her breathing through increasingly frequent contractions. The territorial survey map provided exact measurements and reference points, allowing Jesse to work with a precision that surprised him. His grandfather had trained him well in the practical skills of ranching, but Jesse had never realized how much he had absorbed about surveying and legal documentation until this moment when everything depended on getting it right. As he worked, Lottie called out updates that tracked both their external threats and her internal struggle. "Riders coming up the canyon. Contractions every 8 minutes now. Jesse, you need to hurry." But the ancient survey map held one more surprise that neither of them had expected. As Jesse traced the underground water flow patterns his great-grandfather had documented, he realized that the Apache Spring wasn't just a single source. It was the head of an entire underground river system that fed every well and creek in the valley. "Lottie," he called out, his voice thick with amazement, "this isn't just about our ranch. According to these measurements, the Colt family has prior claim to the water rights under every piece of property in 3 counties. She understood the implications immediately. Sebastian hasn't just failed to buy water right, she's been purchasing land that can't legally exist without our water. Every ranch, every town lot, every mining claim, they're all dependent on water sources your family documented and claimed 60 years ago. The sound of Sebastian's men reached the canyon mouth just as Jesse finished taking his final measurements. Garrett's voice echoed off the stone walls, his earlier confidence replaced by the urgency of a man who understood that his employer's entire scheme hung in the balance. "Mrs. Van Alstyne, we know you're in there. Come out now, and nobody gets hurt." But it was Jesse who answered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had just discovered he wasn't fighting for his family's failing ranch, was defending a legacy that made him one of the most important landowners in the territory. "The name is Mrs. Colt," he called back, "and you're trespassing on property that belongs to my family by territorial right and prior claim." Garrett's laughter echoed harshly off the canyon walls. "Your family doesn't own anything, Cowboy. By tomorrow, it'll all belong to Mr. Arkwright." "Not according to the territorial survey filed by Edmund Colt in 1825. Jesse replied, holding up the ancient documents. "Every drop of water in this valley flows from sources my great-grandfather claimed and registered before Sebastian Arkwright was even born." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of running water, and Lottie's carefully controlled breathing as another contraction gripped her. When Garrett spoke again, his voice had lost its casual confidence. "That's impossible." Mr. Arkwright researched all the historical claims. "Apparently he missed one," Jesse said, carefully folding the precious documents and securing them in his saddlebag. "Lottie, can you ride?" She nodded, though the cost was written clearly on her face. "The contractions are 6 minutes apart now. We have maybe an hour before." She didn't need to finish. They both understood that an hour might be enough to reach the land office and file their claim, but only if they moved fast and Sebastian's men didn't stop them. As Jesse helped her mount her mare, Lottie's hand found his with a grip that spoke of pain, determination, and something deeper than either had expected when their desperate alliance began. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that this Suzette stopped being pretend somewhere along the way." Jesse looked into her eyes and saw reflected there the same transformation he had felt in himself. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had become something real and lasting, forged in shared danger and sealed by mutual trust. "I know," he said simply, "for me too." The sound of horses splashing through the spring water told them that Garrett and his men had entered the canyon. The race for the land office was about to begin, but now the stakes included not just their marriage and Lottie's freedom, but the largest water rights claim in territorial history and the birth of a child who would inherit a legacy neither parent had imagined possible. As they rode out of the hidden canyon where Apache water had sustained life for generations, Jesse carried his great-grandfather's survey map and his grandfather's carved gourd, symbols of a heritage that stretched back to the earliest days of the territory. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Ahead, the territorial land office waited with its brass seal and the power to legitimize their desperate gamble. Between them rode a woman in labor, carrying the future of the Colt family legacy and proving with every mile that courage came in many forms, but none more powerful than a mother's determination to protect her child. The Winchester rifle felt familiar in Jesse's hands as he checked the action one final time, the well-oiled mechanism working with the smooth precision his father had taught him to maintain. This wasn't the gun of a desperate man anymore. It was the weapon of someone defending a legacy that stretched back 3 generations and water rights that could reshape the entire territory. "Contractions every 4 minutes now," Lottie said through gritted teeth, her hands gripping the saddle horn as another wave of pain swept through her. "Jesse, this baby isn't going to wait for legal proceedings." They had made good time from the canyon, but Sebastian's men were closing the distance with the professional persistence of hunters who understood their quarry was wounded. Worse, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and the land office closed at sunset, regardless of how desperate their circumstances might be. "How far?" Lottie asked, though she already knew the answer would test the limits of what was possible. 8 miles to Martinez Station, Jesse replied, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail for signs of pursuit. "Maybe 45 minutes if we push hard." "And if we don't push hard?" Jesse didn't answer because they both knew that anything less than desperate speed would mean arriving at a closed land office with useless documents and Sebastian's custody papers waiting to tear their family apart before it could truly begin. Father Mateo materialized out of a dry wash beside the trail like a guardian angel, armed with practical intelligence instead of heavenly intervention. His horse was lathered with hard travel, and his usually calm demeanor showed the strain of a man carrying urgent news. "Jesse, thank God I found you," the priest called out, reining in beside them. "Sebastian's men aren't just following you, they're planning to ambush the trail into town." "How do you know?" "I overheard them talking outside the cantina. They figure if they can't stop you from reaching the spring, they'll make sure you never reach the land office with whatever you found." Lottie's sharp cry interrupted their conversation as another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. When it passed, her face was pale as desert sand, but her voice remained steady. "There has to be another way into town," she said. "Some route they wouldn't expect." Jesse was already thinking, his mind mapping the territory he had known since childhood. The old Apache Trail over Sentinel Ridge. It's rough country, but it cuts 5 miles off the distance to town. Can she make it? Mateo asked, his concerned gaze taking in Lottie's obvious distress. I can make it, Lottie answered for herself, though the cost was written clearly in the lines of strain around her eyes. What I can't do is give birth to this baby in Sebastian's custody. Mateo reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. I sent word to the territorial rangers about Sebastian's interstate kidnapping scheme. Captain Morrison is riding from Santa Fe with federal authority to arrest anyone interfering with territorial water rights claims. How long until he arrives? Maybe 2 hours, maybe more. But Jesse, there's something else you need to know. Sebastian has convinced Judge Clemmer to issue a temporary restraining order against any new water rights filings until your marriage case is resolved. The news hit them like a physical blow. Even if they reached the land office in time, Sebastian's legal maneuvering might prevent them from filing their claim until after the marriage nullification hearing rendered their water rights worthless. Unless, Mateo continued, his eyes bright with the kind of inspiration that had made him a legendary problem solver among his scattered congregation. The filing is made by someone who isn't party to the marriage dispute. Jesse stared at his old friend, understanding dawning like sunrise over the desert. You mean? I mean that if Father Mateo Sandoval, acting as legal representative for the Colt family estate, were to file historical water rights based on territorial survey documents predating any current legal disputes, Judge Clemmer's restraining order wouldn't apply. Lottie managed to smile despite her pain. You sneaky, wonderful priest. That's brilliant. It's also risky, Mateo admitted. If Sebastian can prove the documents are fraudulent, or that I'm exceeding my authority as a family representative, we could all face federal charges. Another contraction struck Lottie with increased intensity, and this time Jesse saw something in her face that chilled his blood. The baby was coming, whether they were ready or not, and the rough trail over Sentinel Ridge suddenly seemed impossible for a woman in active labor. Maybe we should find a place for you to rest, Jesse said gently. Let the baby come safely, and then— No, Lottie interrupted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had made her choice and would accept no argument. This baby is going to be born free, on land that belongs to our family, with parents who are legally married under territorial law. I don't care if I have to give birth in the land office itself. Jesse looked at this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life and transformed everything he thought he knew about courage, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. She wasn't just the mother of his child. Anymore, she was his partner in every sense that mattered, and he would follow her into hell if that's what it took to protect their family. Then we ride for Sentinel Ridge, he said, checking his rifle one more time. Mateo, you take the documents and head straight for the land office. File everything under your name as family representative. What about you? We'll be right behind you. But if something happens, if Sebastian's men stop us— Jesse's voice trailed off as he handed over the precious survey papers that represented generations of Colt family legacy. Nothing's going to happen, Lottie said firmly, accepting Jesse's help to adjust her position in the saddle. We've come too far and fought too hard to lose now. As they prepared to separate Mateo, heading for the main trail to town, while Jesse and Lottie attempted the dangerous route over Sentinel Ridge, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley. Sebastian's men had found their trail and were sending a message that mercy wasn't on the table anymore. Go, Jesse told Mateo, slapping the priest's horse on the rump. File those papers and trust God to get us there in time to sign them. Father Mateo spurred his horse toward the main trail, carrying documents that could reshape the territorial water rights system and potentially make the Colt family one of the most powerful landholding operations in the Southwest. Behind him, Jesse and Lottie turned toward Sentinel Ridge and a trail that would test every ounce of strength and determination they possessed. Jesse, Lottie said as they started up the rocky slope, I need you to know something. If this baby comes before we reach town, I want you to be the one to deliver it. He looked at her in alarm. "Lottie, I've never—" "You've delivered calves and foals," she said with a smile that was both brave and terrified. "The principle is the same, and you have the steadiest hands of any man I've ever known." Jesse felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like his grandfather's old coat, big at first, but gradually becoming the perfect fit for the man he was meant to become. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Ahead, the narrow trail wound through country so rough that a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into the canyon below. "Hold tight," he said, guiding his horse onto the ancient Apache path that might be their salvation or their final resting place. "We're going to show Sebastian what frontier justice looks like." As they climbed into the gathering dusk, with Lottie fighting to stay conscious through increasingly frequent contractions and Jesse scanning the trail ahead for ambushes, neither could have imagined that their desperate flight would become the stuff of territorial legend, the story of how a failing rancher and a pregnant woman turned the tables on Eastern money and corruption through courage, love, and the kind of stubborn determination that had built the frontier, one impossible choice at a time. The sun was already touching the western peaks, and the land office would close in less than an hour. Behind them, muzzle flashes lit the approaching darkness as Sebastian's men closed in for what they intended to be the final confrontation. Ahead, the lights of Martinez Station twinkled in the distance like stars, offering hope to travelers lost in the wilderness. Between them rode two people who had discovered that pretend love could become something deeper than either had dared to imagine, carrying a child who would inherit not just a ranch, but a legacy that stretched back to the earliest days when courage and water rights were the only currency that mattered in the vast, unforgiving, beautiful territory they now called home. The surveyor's chain felt like salvation in Jesse's hands as he worked with desperate precision to measure the final boundaries around the Apache Spring. Each link of the ancient tool represented legal proof, territorial legitimacy, and the difference between victory and complete destruction. But time was running out faster than water through sand, and Lottie's contractions were now coming every 2 minutes with an intensity that left her gasping against the boulder where she had taken shelter. "Jesse," she called out, her voice strained but determined. "Riders coming up the canyon, maybe 6 of them." He looked up from his measurements to see dust clouds marking the approach of Sebastian's men, their horses moving with the steady purpose of professional hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Garrett rode in the lead, his shoulder bandaged, but his gun hand steady, followed by the kind of hard men who solved problems with bullets rather than legal documents. "How much more?" Lottie asked, gripping the stone as another wave of pain swept through her. "2 more measurements," Jesse replied, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency his grandfather had taught him. "Maybe 3 minutes if I'm careful." "You don't have 3 minutes," she said, watching the approaching riders. "They'll be here in—" Her words dissolved into a cry of pain as the strongest contraction yet seized her body. Jesse made a decision that would have horrified his careful, methodical grandfather, but was the only choice available to a man whose wife was in labor and whose enemies were closing in fast. He grabbed the surveyor's stakes and began driving them into the ground at the approximate locations his measurements indicated, trusting to experience and instinct to place them correctly. "Close enough," he muttered, pulling out the territorial claim papers and signing them with a hand that remained steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Lottie, can you sign?" She reached for the pen with trembling fingers, managing to scrawl her name, just as Garrett's voice echoed off the canyon walls with the authority of someone who believed himself to be in complete control. "End of the trail, folks. Come out with your hands up and nobody gets hurt." But Jesse had already made his choice. He helped Lottie to her feet and toward their horses, the precious claim papers tucked safely in his shirt pocket next to his heart. The Apache water gourd bounced against his saddle horn as he mounted, its ancient carvings seeming to whisper encouragement from generations of people who had fought to protect this sacred place. "Mrs. Van Alstyne," Garrett called out again, "you're only making this harder on yourself." "The name," Lottie called back, settling carefully into her saddle despite the obvious agony it caused. "Is Mrs. Colt, and we're not going anywhere with you." The gunfire started before Garrett finished his reply. Jesse's rifle spoke first, sending a warning shot that ricocheted off the canyon walls with the sharp crack of absolute determination. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, but he wanted Sebastian's men to understand that this wouldn't be the easy capture they had anticipated. "Go!" he shouted to Lottie, slapping her mare on the rump to send the animal racing toward the narrow canyon mouth that led to freedom. But even as they rode, Jesse could see that escape wouldn't be simple. Two of Sebastian's men had positioned themselves at the canyon entrance, their rifles trained on the only route out. It was a classic ambush, professionally executed, and it left them trapped between the spring and the guns. Unless they took the path no sane person would attempt. "This way," Jesse called, turning his horse toward what looked like a sheer rock face, but was actually the beginning of an ancient Apache escape route his grandfather had shown him once when he was 12 years old. The trail, if it could be called, that was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, carved into the canyon wall by countless generations of Apache warriors who had needed a way to disappear when enemies threatened their water source. Jesse had only traveled it once, and that had been in daylight, with his grandfather's steady guidance. Now, in the gathering dusk with Sebastian's men firing behind them, he was asking Lottie to trust her life and their unborn child to a path that existed more in memory than reality. "I can't see the trail," Lottie called out, her voice tight with pain and fear. "Trust the horse," Jesse replied, remembering his grandfather's words from that long-ago day. "She can feel the path even when we can't see it." Behind them, Garrett's curses echoed off the stone walls as he realized his quarry was attempting something that bordered on suicide. The Apache Trail was known to exist, but no white man had successfully navigated it in living memory. Most considered it a legend, a story told around campfires to explain how Apache warriors could vanish from supposedly inescapable canyons. Jesse's mare picked her way carefully along the narrow ledge, her hooves finding purchase on stone worn smooth by centuries of use. Below them, the canyon floor dropped away into darkness that seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. Ahead, the trail disappeared around a bend that offered either salvation or a dead end that would trap them on the mountainside. "Jesse," Lottie gasped, "I can't the baby." Another contraction gripped her with savage intensity, and for a terrifying moment Jesse thought she might fall from the saddle into the abyss below. But she held on with the desperate strength of a woman who had already sacrificed too much to surrender now. "Almost there," he lied, having no idea how much farther the trail continued. "Just hold on a little longer." The sound of horses behind them suggested that at least some of Sebastian's men were brave or foolish enough to attempt pursuit on the Apache Trail. Jesse could hear Garrett's voice urging his men forward, though the words were distorted by echoes and distance. "There." Lottie pointed ahead with a shaking hand. Jesse looked up to see what she had spotted: a gap in the canyon wall that opened onto the mesa above, the end of the Apache escape route and their passage to freedom. But it was still 50 yards away, 50 yards of trail so narrow that one misstep would end everything they had fought to achieve. "We're going to make it," he said, though he was speaking as much to himself as to her. But even as the words left his mouth, disaster struck. Lottie's mare, exhausted by the treacherous footing and spooked by the sound of gunfire behind them, stumbled on a loose stone and went to her knees on the narrow ledge. For a heart-stopping moment, horse and rider teetered on the edge of eternity. Jesse reached out instinctively, his hand closing on Lottie's arm just as her mare scrambled back to her feet. "I've got you," he said, though his own horse was dancing nervously on the narrow path. "The papers," Lottie gasped. "Don't let go of the papers." Even in her pain and fear, she was thinking about the documents that represented their only hope of legal victory. Jesse felt a surge of admiration for this remarkable woman who had faced down Boston lawyers, territorial corruption, and Apache trails with equal courage. "Safe and sound," he assured her, patting his shirt pocket. The gap in the canyon wall loomed ahead, promising escape from the narrow ledge that had become both their salvation and their potential tomb. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing fainter as Sebastian's men discovered that professional gunfighters weren't necessarily equipped for Apache-style mountain climbing. "Just a little farther," Jesse said, guiding his horse toward the opening that would deliver them onto the mesa above. As they emerged from the canyon onto level ground, the lights of Martinez Station twinkled in the distance like beacons of hope. But between them and the town lay several miles of open country, and Sebastian undoubtedly had more men positioned to intercept them on the main trails. "How long until the land office closes?" Lottie asked, her face pale in the starlight. Jesse pulled out his father's old pocket watch, squinting at the hands in the uncertain light. 20 minutes, maybe 25. "Then we'd better ride like the devil himself is chasing us," she said, gathering her reins despite the obvious cost. Jesse looked at this extraordinary woman who had transformed his understanding of courage and determination, and felt something settle permanently into place in his chest. Whatever happened in the next 20 minutes, whatever the outcome of their desperate gamble, he knew with absolute certainty that Charlotte Colt was exactly where she belonged beside him, fighting for their family's future with the kind of stubborn grace that had built the frontier, one impossible choice at a time. "Hold tight," he said, spurring his horse toward the distant lights of town. "We're going to show Sebastian Arkwright what it means to mess with the Colt family." The land office recording stamp gleamed like salvation in the lamplight as Jesse and Lottie collapsed against the doorframe, their horses lathered with foam and their own bodies pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Spring water from Jesse's canteen dripped onto the official territorial map spread across the clerk's desk, each drop a testament to the ancient source they had fought so desperately to claim. "Filing just under the wire," commented Daniel Morrison, the territorial land clerk, as he examined their hastily completed papers. "Another 5 minutes, and I'd have been locking up for the night." Jesse helped Lottie to a chair, her face grey with pain, as contractions came now with relentless intensity. Father Mateo appeared beside them like an answered prayer, his own filing completed just moments before their arrival. "The water rights are recorded under my name as family representative," Mateo reported quickly. "Historical claim dating back to 1825, signed and sealed before Judge Clemmer's restraining order could take effect." "And the marriage dowry provision?" Lottie asked through gritted teeth. "Filed simultaneously," Jesse said, producing the precious documents from his shirt pocket. "Half the water rights deeded to Charlotte Colt as settlement, making our marriage legally unbreakable under territorial law." Morrison's stamp descended toward the official papers, just as the land office door burst open with explosive force. Sebastian Arkwright strode in with the bearing of a man accustomed to having the world rearrange itself according to his wishes, followed by Judge Clemmer and 2 territorial deputies who looked distinctly uncomfortable with their role in the proceedings. "Stop," Sebastian commanded, his voice carrying the authority of substantial wealth and political connections. "Those documents are fraudulent, filed in violation of a court order, and—" His words died as Morrison's stamp hit the papers with the solid authority of territorial law. The brass seal pressed into the wax with finality, and the clerk's signature completed the legal transformation that made Jesse and Lottie's desperate gamble an unbreakable reality. "Too late," Morrison said mildly, not looking up from his work. "Water rights are recorded, marriage dowry is filed, and all documents are properly witnessed and sealed." Sebastian's face went through several shades of red as he realized that months of careful planning and considerable expense had been undone by a failing rancher and a pregnant woman with more courage than sense. "Judge Clemmer," he said, turning to his bought and paid for legal authority, "surely you can invalidate these filings based on the restraining order." But Clemmer was studying the documents with the expression of a man who suddenly understood that he had backed the wrong horse in a very expensive race. "The restraining order only applied to filings by parties to the marriage dispute," he said slowly. "These water rights were filed by Father Sandoval as family representative, which appears to be legally distinct." "What about the marriage itself?" Sebastian demanded. I have witnesses who will testify that these two people had never met before 3 days ago. Morrison looked up from his paperwork with the patient expression of someone who had seen every possible variation of frontier drama. That might matter if the marriage could be dissolved, he said. But territorial law is clear about dowry settlements. Once property has been legally transferred between spouses and recorded with the territory, the marriage becomes unbreakable regardless of original circumstances. Sebastian stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, his carefully constructed scheme crumbling around him like a poorly built dam in spring flood. This is impossible. I own the water rights to half this valley. Actually, Matteo said, consulting his copy of the historical survey, what you own is surface rights to land that can't legally exist without water provided by the Colt family claim. Your purchases are worthless without access to the underground water system that feeds every well and spring in 3 counties. The sound that emerged from Sebastian's throat was part rage, part disbelief, and entirely the reaction of a man who had just discovered that his victims were neither helpless nor ignorant. He had come west expecting to overwhelm frontier justice with Eastern money, only to learn that territorial law had teeth sharper than any Boston courtroom. You haven't won yet, he said, his voice dropping to the cold tone of someone who had exhausted legal options and was considering alternatives that didn't involve courts or judges. There are other ways to solve problems. But even as the words left his mouth, the land office door opened again to admit Captain Morrison of the Territorial Rangers, accompanied by 4 federal agents whose badges carried authority that transcended local politics and personal wealth. Sebastian Arkwright? Captain Morrison asked, though his tone suggested the question was merely a formality. I am. You're under arrest for interstate kidnapping, conspiracy to defraud territorial water rights, and bribery of territorial officials. Sebastian's face went white as the implications hit him. This is outrageous. I have political connections, federal appointments. You had political connections, Captain Morrison corrected, until word reached Washington about your scheme to manipulate territorial water rights for personal gain. Turns out the federal government takes a dim view of Eastern money trying to corner natural resources through legal fraud. As the federal agents surrounded Sebastian, Judge Clemmer made a quiet attempt to slip out the back door of the land office. But Captain Morrison's voice stopped him with the authority of someone who had been tracking this particular corruption case for weeks. Judge Clemmer, I believe we need to discuss some irregular donations to your court's discretionary fund. Clemmer's shoulders sagged as he realized that his own greed had made him a target of federal investigation. The money Sebastian had used to buy his cooperation would now serve as evidence in a corruption case that would end his judicial career and probably result in federal prison time. The dowry claim, Lottie whispered to Jesse, her hand finding his as another contraction gripped her. Is it really legal? Are we really safe? Morrison checked his paperwork one final time, then nodded with satisfaction. Mrs. Colt, according to territorial law and these properly filed documents, your marriage is as legally binding as any union in the territory. The water rights belong to your family, and no court can change that without your consent. Jesse felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. 3 days ago, he had been a failing rancher, facing foreclosure and the loss of his family's legacy. Now he was one of the largest water rights holders in the territory, married to a remarkable woman, and about to become a father to a child who would inherit a fortune built on courage rather than corruption. Sebastian, he said as the federal agents prepared to escort their prisoner to the territorial jail, you made one critical mistake in all your planning. What's that? Sebastian asked, his voice hollow with defeat. You assumed that money was the only thing that mattered. But some things can't be bought, they have to be earned. As Sebastian was led away in federal custody, his dreams of controlling the territorial water supply dissolving like desert mirages, Lottie's grip on Jesse's hand suddenly tightened with an intensity that had nothing to do with legal victories or water rights. Jesse, she gasped, I think our baby has decided not to wait for a proper birthing room. Morrison looked up from his paperwork with alarm. Ma'am, surely you're not. I am, Lottie said firmly, another contraction making her double over with pain. And unless there's a doctor hiding in your filing cabinets, my husband is going to have to deliver this child right here in the Territorial Land Office. Jesse felt his knees go weak at the prospect, but he had learned something important about himself over the past 3 days. When the people he loved needed him, he could find strength he never knew he possessed. Morrison, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them, I need clean cloths, hot water, and all the space you can give us. But sir, this is a government office, and we're about to make some very important territorial history, Jesse replied, helping Lottie to a more comfortable position. The first baby born as a citizen of the largest water rights claim in New Mexico territory. As Father Mateo began preparing for an impromptu baptism, and Morrison scrambled to find clean blankets, Jesse looked down at his wife and felt the last pretense fall away from their relationship. Whatever else happened, however their marriage had begun, this moment would seal it with bonds stronger than any legal document. Ready, he asked, though the question applied to much more than childbirth. Ready, Lottie replied, her eyes bright with pain, hope, and the absolute trust that had carried them through every impossible challenge they had faced. Outside, the territorial stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but somehow blessing the moment when a pretend marriage became real through shared courage, and a failing ranch transformed into a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The baby's first blanket was fashioned from Jesse's mother's wedding dress, the cream-colored silk transformed by necessity and love into swaddling clothes for the newest member of the Colt family. As dawn painted the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and rose, little Mary Elizabeth Colt slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she had been born into a legacy that stretched back to the earliest days of the territory. She's beautiful, Jesse whispered, his voice thick with emotions he was still learning to name. 3 days ago, he had been a stranger to fatherhood, marriage, and hope itself. Now he found himself gazing down at a perfect, tiny face and feeling as if his entire life had been preparation for this single moment. Lottie smiled up at him from the makeshift bed in the land office, her exhaustion tempered by the radiant satisfaction of a woman who had fought every battle required to protect her child and emerged victorious. She has your stubborn chin, she said softly. She's going to be a force to reckon with. Father Mateo finished the brief baptism ceremony, his grandfather's carved crucifix catching the early morning light as he blessed the child, who represented not just a new life, but the renewal of hope for the Colt family legacy. Mary Elizabeth Colt, he said solemnly, may you grow strong in the knowledge that you are deeply loved and that this land your parents fought to protect will always be your home. Outside the land office, the first trickle of spring water was already making its way through the irrigation ditches Jesse had thought permanently dry. The ancient Apache source flowed with the same generous abundance it had provided for countless generations, and the legal documents filed the night before ensured that flow would continue to sustain Colt family crops for generations to come. The irony isn't lost on me, Jesse said, watching the water sparkle in the sunrise. Sebastian spent months trying to buy control of water that was already ours by right. Not just ours, Lottie corrected gently, shifting the baby to a more comfortable position. The historical survey shows your great-grandfather intended those water rights to benefit the entire valley. He understood that prosperity shared is prosperity secured. It was true. The documents revealed Edmund Colt's vision of a water-sharing system that would support multiple ranches and the growing town of Martinez Station, with the Colt family serving as stewards rather than monopolists of the precious resource. It was a legacy of community rather than conquest, cooperation rather than control. Daniel Morrison emerged from his office with a cup of coffee and the bemused expression of a man who had witnessed one of the most extraordinary nights in territorial history. Mrs. Colt, he said formally, I've completed all the paperwork for your daughter's birth certificate. She's officially the first child born with inherited water rights to 3 counties. What about Sebastian? Jesse asked. Federal custody, Morrison replied with satisfaction. Turns out, the territorial governor received some very interesting telegrams from Washington about Eastern money trying to manipulate water rights for railroad development. Sebastian's scheme went much deeper than just your family's situation. Father Mateo nodded grimly. He was planning to control water access to force small ranchers to sell to railroad developers. Your family's claim was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Jesse felt a chill as he realized how close they had come to losing not just their own ranch, but participating unknowingly in the destruction of an entire way of life. The frontier was changing, Eastern money was flooding west, and families like his were often the first casualties of what powerful men called progress. Well, he said, settling carefully beside Lottie and their daughter, at least now we know what we're really fighting for. As the morning progressed, the land office became an impromptu celebration as word spread through Martinez Station about the dramatic conclusion to Sebastian's scheme. Tom Martinez arrived with fresh bread and coffee. Mrs. Delgado brought proper baby clothes, and other ranchers stopped by to shake Jesse's hand and welcome Lottie to the community. "You did more than save your own ranch," explained Bill Henderson, whose spread bordered the Colt property. "That water-sharing agreement your great-grandfather set up means all of us have secure access to irrigation. Sebastian could have destroyed every small operation in the valley." Lottie listened to the conversations swirling around them and began to understand the full implications of what they had accomplished. Their desperate flight from Boston corruption had become something larger, a victory for community values over corporate manipulation, for frontier justice over Eastern influence. "Jesse," she said quietly as the visitors began to disperse, "I want you to know that when I asked you to pretend to be my husband, I never imagined it would become so wonderfully real." He looked down at her, this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life and transformed everything he thought he knew about courage, love, and the meaning of family. "Lottie, I think the pretending stopped the moment you trusted me enough to ask for help. Everything after that has been the most genuine thing I've ever experienced." Baby Mary stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed already to hold the wisdom of someone born into a legacy of struggle and triumph. Jesse reached out to touch her tiny hand, marveling at the perfect fingers that would someday work this land, the strong grip that suggested she had indeed inherited the stubborn determination that defined Colt family character. "What happens now?" Lottie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Now we go home," Jesse said simply. "We plant crops that the spring water will sustain. We raise our daughter to understand the responsibility that comes with stewardship, and we prove that some kinds of wealth can't be measured in dollars." The ride back to the homestead was a gentle procession, with Father Mateo and several neighbor families accompanying the new family to ensure their safe arrival. As they crested the rise that offered the first view of the Colt property, Jesse felt his breath catch at the transformation that had already begun. The spring water was flowing clear and strong through irrigation ditches that had been dry for 3 years. The brown earth was already showing hints of green where dormant seeds were responding to the life-giving moisture. The windmill, silent and broken for so long, would soon turn again as Jesse repaired the mechanism that would distribute water throughout their expanding operation. "It's going to be beautiful," Lottie said, cradling their daughter as she surveyed the land that was now truly their home. "It already is," Jesse replied, helping her down from the wagon with the careful attention of a man who understood that his most precious cargo was the family he had gained through courage rather than inheritance. As the sun reached its zenith over the New Mexico territory, casting sharp shadows across land that had seen Apache camps, Spanish explorers, Mexican settlers, and now the latest chapter in the continuing story of American expansion, the Colt family began their new life together. The baby's quilt fashioned from Jesse's mother's wedding dress caught the breeze and fluttered like a banner of hope over a homestead that had been saved by love disguised as necessity. Jesse stood in the doorway of the house his grandfather had built, watching Lottie settle their daughter in the cradle he had hastily assembled from memory and determination, and felt the weight of 3 generations of Colt family dreams settling comfortably on his shoulders. He was no longer the last of his line, facing the loss of everything his family had built. He was the father of a new generation, the husband of a remarkable woman, and the steward of a legacy that would endure as long as water flowed from the ancient springs that connected all life in this harsh, beautiful, unforgiving land. The tarnished spurs that had belonged to his father and grandfather hung now in the place of honor above the fireplace, polished to gleaming silver and ready to be passed down to another generation when the time came. But first, there were crops to plant, fences to mend, and a daughter to raise who would grow up knowing that courage and love were the only inheritance that truly mattered. Water flowed, hope flourished, and the Colt family legacy began anew under the vast sky that had witnessed their transformation from strangers united by desperation into a family forged by choice, sealed by commitment, and destined to prove that some kinds of wealth could never be stolen by those who measured value only in gold.